So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all, wherever in this world you might be. I warmly welcome you to this virtual event, Making the UN Human Rights Mechanisms Work for Youth, an initiative which celebrates and promotes youth participation and engagement on human rights issues in international policy-making spaces. I am Sine Aurora. I'm the director of the London office of the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative. CHRI, the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, is an international non-governmental organization dedicated to the realization of human rights across the Commonwealth. And we do this through research, advocacy, capacity building, and the strengthening of networks and coalitions. And we are an accredited Commonwealth organization, and we're proud to be part of this event today. This event actually is a partnership between CHRI, the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, and the Commonwealth Trade Union Group, as well as the Commonwealth Secretariat, and is part of a wider program of work, which is celebrating the Commonwealth's Year of Youth. And this Year of Youth recognizes and promotes the engagement and empowerment of young people, ensuring that the issues young people care about are highlighted and moved to the top of the Commonwealth agenda. So today I am very delighted to share this space with three youth leaders who have used the international human rights frameworks and mechanisms to amplify the human rights concerns and priorities of young people and to successfully push for change. Their efforts have led to the integration of youth voice in international policies and also to changes in national laws and policies. So before I introduce you to our brilliant panel, first, maybe I can take you through a bit of housekeeping. So again, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, if not done so already. Include your name, organization, university, your country, and maybe also why you're here. I hope that you are excited, as excited to be here as I am. Please also use the chat to comment on the dialogue and, of course, ask questions. There will be time later on in the session for a Q&A, so we will be taking your questions and ensuring that the panelists will get a chance to respond to them. This webinar will be recorded, as I mentioned, so that those who are unable to join us today can access the event at a later time. So what is this event today all about? You may have heard that youth participation is a fundamental right. Young people represent over half of the global population, and as such, they are a powerful force for change. So if we want to foster robust and inclusive democracies, we need to hear the voices of our young people. Young people are not only the future of their country's development and progress, but they are also very much part of the present. And they should have the power to influence the world around them. And this is especially important given that some of the world's toughest challenges that we're seeing disproportionately affect youth. And this includes unemployment, environmental degradation, violent conflict, and displacement. So I will now share just a few words about some of the international mechanisms you will be hearing about today. And I'll ask my colleague Lucia to just share a slide. So this is just for everyone to get on the same page in terms of what we're talking about. We're talking about some international framework. So here you'll see the United Nations. Now, the United Nations, as you know, came about in just soon after World War II to make sure that the horrors of World War II were never again to be replicated. Now, there are some challenges with the UN system, but this is the system we have to ensure that states, UN member states, are adhering to their obligations, including human rights obligations. Now, the United Nations framework may seem complicated and inaccessible, but we will today aim to demystify the UN, showing that it's a mechanism that, while having its flaws, is an institution and a framework that can be used to our advantage to hold governments and decision makers to account. And we'll be talking about how the UN has been accessed by young people. So we have here a simplified diagram of the broad structure of the UN system. You can see how each of the mechanisms and structures relate to each other. In Geneva, we have the main UN institutions that relate to human rights. This is the UN Human Rights Council, which is the primary UN mechanism for human rights protection and promotion. The Human Rights Council includes the mechanisms of the special procedures, which are the independent experts on specific human rights themes or specific countries. And it also includes the Universal Periodic Review, which is a peer-led review of the human rights progress or situation in every UN member state. In Geneva also, there is the mechanism of the treaty bodies, and these are the committees of independent experts that are tasked with monitoring the implementation of the international human rights conventions or treaties. And then, of course, there's the Office of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which acts as a secretariat to all of the UN human rights bodies in Geneva. And of course, the bodies in New York, which are the General Assembly, the Security Council, and the Economic and Social Council. So I wanted to mention also that while the UN is a major player in the international space for international policymaking, it is not only the only, it's not the only international mechanism that you can engage in. There are other institutions, agencies like the International Labour Organization, and also regional mechanisms that we'll be touching upon later on. So since World War II, as I mentioned, and the UN and others have produced comprehensive legal frameworks, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which you've probably heard about, as well as international conventions, treaties, and soft law like general recommendations and comments, which obligate states to adhere to human rights principles. And once states sign on to these international principles and standards, they are obligated to implement or domesticate these laws in their countries. But we know that this doesn't always happen. So this, of course, is a summary, which we will delve into a little bit more in detail during our discussion with our experts, who I know are waiting patiently here. And so shall we get on with it? As mentioned earlier, today we have 3 youth leaders who will share their stories of using international laws and mechanisms to push for change. So I'd like to introduce them to you now. First, we have Poppy Stanbury. So Poppy is a queer intersectional feminist who works for Choice for Youth and Sexuality in the Netherlands and is a human rights defender for the sexual and reproductive rights of young people. As advocacy and communications coordinator at Choice, Poppy works with young people to advocate for their rights at the UN Human Rights Council and to make the human rights mechanisms more youth inclusive. So welcome, Poppy, to this session. Next is Ishan Shah. At the age of 13, Ishan co-founded Stolen Dreams, a youth-led collective working with stakeholders internationally to end modern slavery and human trafficking. And he's done this through education, advocacy, and policy. Based in the UK, he also advises several UN agencies with a focus on monitoring, supporting, and strengthening intergovernmental processes by ensuring human rights and gender equality are centered. Welcome to you, Ishan. So finally, Luke James Trim. Luke is CARICOM's youth ambassador and president of Tobago's Students Association. Luke is an advocate and media activist working to amplify the voices of marginalized youth regionally in the Caribbean region. Through his activism, he spotlights the voices and concerns of young people in the Caribbean community, challenges norms, advocates for equality, and empowers youth to actively shape their future. So welcome, Luke. Welcome to you all. So, and I see that the chat is being actively used by everyone. Thank you all for introducing yourselves. I'm going to turn now to the panel, and the first question to the panel. So you may have heard of this, that youth participation is a fundamental right. It's one of the guiding principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that is also reiterated in many other international conventions and declarations. In fact, in 2015, the United Nations Security Council adopted unanimously a groundbreaking resolution on youth peace and security, which recognizes that young people play an important and positive role in the maintenance and promotion of international peace and security. And this landmark resolution urges member states to give youth a greater voice in decision making at local, national, regional, and international levels. And also it urges states to consider setting up mechanisms that would enable young people to participate meaningfully in peace processes and decision-making processes. So youth participation is a fundamental right. So here is the first question for all of our panelists to start us off. Why do you think youth participation is important in policy-making processes? So, Poppy, let's start with you.
Yeah, sorry, thank you. And thank you for the introduction as well. I also want to add that as well as the resolution that you mentioned in the Human Rights Council itself, there's also been multiple resolutions on youth and the human rights of youth as well. And there's some really strong language there. I mean, why is youth participation important? Because every human rights issue affects young people. There are the Human Rights Council mechanisms, they address every single human rights violation or issue, and whether it's from hazardous waste to land rights or the right to health, everything affects young people. And young people have the experience of what it's like to be young in the world today. And the quote unquote adults might not necessarily. So young people need to be at the table and really meaningfully participating in policy-making processes to make decisions about our lives, because these policies need to reflect the lived realities of our lives. And when you look at, for example, to take the Human Rights Council as the main example, there are, like, every state engages, right? And every state also has a group of diplomats, representatives of their delegation. But these diplomats they're not necessarily experts on every issue, because their portfolio ranges across all human rights issues. So they really actually rely on civil society, on youth activists to bring the expertise. And so if you can create a good relationship with your country or with other state diplomats, then you can really meaningfully engage in policymaking processes at the Human Rights Council or the other mechanisms, and make sure that youth language is mainstreamed throughout, and make sure that young people are actually physically in the room as well, to reflect the issues that we face.
Mm-hmm. No, thanks, Poppy. I'll turn it right over to Ishan. What about you? Why is youth participation important in policymaking processes?
I would firstly echo everything that Poppy said. I think it's so important for policy processes to be informed by lived experience. And I truly believe that as young people, we are experts in our own lived realities, and policymakers who are often very disconnected, particularly UN decision makers who sit in Geneva and New York, are often very disconnected from the realities of what's happening on the ground. And young people are at the grassroots level leading the change on the ground. And therefore their experiences, the challenges they face, but also the solutions that they are already implementing need to be heard and need to be centered in decision-making processes, so that we can catalyze our efforts towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, but also fulfilling these commitments that member states are making at the UN level. You mentioned the Youth and Peace Security resolution. Poppy mentioned Human Rights Council resolutions. At the 75th anniversary of the UN, member states committed to listen to and work with youth. And now it's time for the decision makers to make that a reality. We now have a UN Youth Office, a whole office in the UN system dedicated towards institutionalizing meaningful youth engagement. So for us as young people, we also need to shift the narrative. It's not necessarily what we can do for the UN, but it's what can the UN do for us, because young people are already leading the change on the ground. And we need to be centered in these processes first and foremost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Ishan, for letting us know that. So Luke, let's turn to you. Why is youth participation important in policymaking processes?
Well, in reality, too often policy is created, and then us as young people, we are included after the fact. For example, right in Trinidad and Tobago, for example, when we are creating the budget, They will create the budget, read the budget, the entire public knows what's going on with the budget. Then they will host a youth conversation about the budget after the fact. And we oftentimes ask ourselves, why is it that we weren't included in the process when the budget was being formulated? Because if we want a budget to really reflect the ideologies of the young people, we cannot be included after the fact. Because when young people are included in policy, that in turn ensures that the policy is really responsive to the needs and the aspirations of young people. Now, I remember when our CARICOM Secretary General, Her Excellency Dr. Carla Barnett, when we would have met her in Antigua, she would have made a commitment to ensure that young people are always included in these decision-making processes. So my opinion is, while youth participation is very important in these policy-making processes, it always comes down to that meaningful relationship between us and the decision makers, because until you see that cohesive relationship between us, that is when you are seeing that our voices as youth, it's really being valued and we are able to really and truly effect change. I want to apologize for the chickens in the background. It's extremely early here in Tobago, so they are just doing their job. And I remember when we were in Guyana not too long ago for the CSME training, and we met the CARICOM Secretary General once again. The topic about youth and policy making came up, and she laid a very, very powerful quote. She said, listen, there is a huge difference between making policy for the youth and making policy with the youth. And it's only until we start to make policy with the youth that we can see that the policy is actually responsive to what the young people are aspiring for. So when you think about youth participation, especially in issues such as human rights, we need to ensure that young people are involved. Because when you involve us as young people, then we are seeing that forward-thinking policies are created.
Hmm. Yeah, thanks, Luke. And no need to apologize about the chickens in the background. We realize that this is a global event, and so we have people from all time zones and all regions and all countries. And we just thank you for being with us so early in the morning in your region. So well said, everyone. I think when we generally when we increase youth participation, we're not just creating policies that reflect young people's priorities and needs. We are also tapping into their energy, their knowledge, and creativity, which drives meaningful change. So this is something also to remember. It's a two-way street, really. So notably, the UN resolution also recognizes the great importance of empowering young people by building their capacity to achieve greater independence, to overcome constraints to their participation, and to provide them with opportunities to make decisions that affect their lives and well-being. So it's a responsibility not just for young people to get active and engaged, but it's also the responsibility for others, like in the UN and other organizations, to ensure those spaces are maintained and open for youth voices. So let's now explore what you and your organizations are doing to promote and indeed harness youth participation. Perhaps you could share an example of an advocacy initiative or a campaign that you undertook and how you use the international human rights system to further the goals of that campaign. Why was using the international system important, and what was the role of young people? So perhaps, Poppy, let's start with you.
Yeah, thank you. And also, I just want to say it's really nice being in this webinar and listening to the other experts, and being in a space where people agree about this as well. So Choice is a youth-led organization. We're completely youth-led in every aspect of what we do. And we work on sexual and reproductive health and rights and meaningful and inclusive youth participation. So for us, a lot of the advocacy work that we do does relate around sexual and reproductive health and rights, and about making advocacy spaces more youth inclusive and more youth friendly. And to do with this latter part of our work, we start in 2019. We started tentatively started this campaign called Youth Up UN, because we looked at the Human Rights Council and all of the mechanisms and the space in Geneva, essentially, and we realized that there is a complete lack of youth presence, whether it's physically or in knowledge for mainstreaming throughout the Secretariat, the special procedures, the Universal Periodic Review. All these different mechanisms are really not youth friendly or youth inclusive at all. And so we started this campaign to try and change that, youthing up the UN essentially. Because also if you look at the UN in New York, there are more initiatives for young people than in Geneva. And we decided to use this international platform because we wanted to have an international standard, to set an international standard on a global level for meaningful and inclusive youth participation. And we wanted to reach people all over the world. So we wanted to connect with states at the Human Rights Council to make sure that, you know, any decision that was made at the Human Rights Council surrounding youth could trickle down regionally, nationally, locally, international level legislation, as opposed to just, I mean, for example, I'm in the Netherlands, as opposed to just focusing on young people here. We wanted to set an international standard. And we found that there was a lot of interest in the Human Rights Council, but there was just no momentum. So Choice, we conducted a workshop towards diplomats about how to be more youth inclusive in a language they were using in resolutions. And from this, it spiraled to being contacted by the Child and Youth Unit of the Human Rights Secretariat to speak at an intersessional. And an intersessional it's what it's called. It's a event between sessions where they focus on one topic. And this time it was about youth, and it was about different youth activists coming together to approach various topics and about how young people can be more included in human rights work. And from then it spiraled to being interviewed. Choice was interviewed by the OHCHR website on meaningful and inclusive youth participation, and then leading to the rollout of the Youth Up UN toolkit and website, which will be discussed or shared later. And essentially this whole campaign came about, and the intersessional led to the interview, led to the website, because we realized how little knowledge there is, even though there is will from a lot of states and a lot of state actors. There is so little knowledge about how to meaningfully include young people in a way that isn't tokenistic, and you know, to address barriers, which I think we'll come to later. But we just realized how much sensitization is needed, and that's where this initiative came from, this advocacy campaign came from, and how much it's needed on the global level. And I'll leave it there because I could talk about this for ages, but I think
Thanks,
I got too much
Poppy.
time.
Thanks, Poppy. Ishan, could you share also, just maybe adding to Poppy's notes about how you use the international human rights system to further the goals of your campaign?
Yeah, so I'll focus on two elements. The first is on the work we do around combating contemporary forms of slavery, modern slavery, and human trafficking. And the second element is looking at sort of gender equality in its broader context, and how we make sure that the resolutions being negotiated by member states reflect the rights of women and girls in all their diversity and intersectional identities. So the first is through the work we do with Stolen Dreams. The Human Rights Council, as you saw on the diagram, has an element called the special procedures and the special rapporteurs. And these are individual experts who are appointed on specific issues. And they produce two reports, one to the Human Rights Council and one to the General Assembly every year with thematic focuses. And it's a very great process in terms of getting civil society and youth inputs to feed into formal reports that are then published and circulated among all member states. And these reports provide very concrete recommendations to those member states on what they can be doing to accelerate the implementation or address an issue in the context of that theme. And the Human Rights Council has a rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery, including its causes and consequences. A wonderful rapporteur, his name is Tomoyo Obokata. A couple of us have worked with him quite a lot. And he's very friendly towards young people, but he never actually consulted a group of young people before for his report. And last year, he did a report to the General Assembly on the theme of contemporary forms of slavery and its intersection with technology. So how technology is used to perpetrate modern slavery, but also how it's used to address it. And obviously, in an increasing digital age, and where young people are increasingly online, and dare I say, chronically online as well, with exacerbated vulnerabilities, but also young people using tech solutions to solve some of the greatest issues of our time too. We convened a great roundtable with about 70 young people from across the world on Zoom. It was like a Zoom consultation. And then we also did an online survey as well, which collated a couple hundred other inputs. And we managed to feed in directly to his report to the General Assembly. And that has essentially set a precedent, sort of signaling to young people that we can actually contribute to UN processes. We can share our expertise, we can share our lived experience, and we can importantly share our recommendations, what's working well in our communities and what do we want to see more of from the member states in particular. So that's been a really great and transformative opportunity, and we're hoping to reconvene and do that again, not only for the Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery, but also to get other youth constituencies to look at what issues they're passionate about and reach out to their parallel or corresponding Special Rapporteur as well to get more youth engagement in those spaces. And then at the York level, in terms of the gender equality side of things, we have a community of young feminists, and Choice and Poppy have been part of that community as well. We have the Young Feminist Caucus, the UN Women National Gender Youth Advocates, the Generation Equality Youth Leaders as well. And together we really rally around this need to make sure that young feminist leadership, but also that gender equality and the rights of women and girls are centered across the entire UN system, because every issue has a gender component to it. And the way in which we do that is, again, we carry out consultations, we go into the communities, we partner with and connect with other youth-led organizations, and we follow these different processes that are happening in the UN. So, for example, the Commission on the Status of Women, which is the largest intergovernmental gathering of member states to advance gender equality, and other processes across the UN space, to really go to member states and say, well, you're going to negotiate a resolution on X, Y, and Z. Well, here are the priorities of young people, in particular of young women and girls. And this is what we want to see as the gold standard of language in the text. And that those recommendations are usually informed by thousands of young people, and we come united with a common messaging, a common theme. And it really builds a sense of community as well in a space such as the UN that's often historically excluded and systemically excluded young people. It allows us to rally together and builds a community, a space for us to really, a safe space to mobilize and really push forward action.
Yeah, thanks, Ishan. I think these are really good examples of how both of you, Poppy and Ishan, you and your organizations were able to bring youth priorities to the table at international level, and also collectively engage with youth at the local level and bring forward those priorities to the international. We'll be talking a little bit more about that later, and how it's these UN mechanisms are really very accessible. It's really joining up with those that have the access and engaging with those to make your voices heard. Now, what about, I'm just going to shift a little bit here and talk about using the international frameworks and laws to support advocacy back home at the national level. So Luke, I'll turn to you here. While Poppy and Ishan have brought issues to the international space, Luke, you have used the international legal frameworks in a different way. Tell us how you used the Global Sustainable Development Goals to strengthen your national campaign.
Okay, sure. So firstly, as CARICOM Youth Ambassador for Trinidad and Tobago, one thing that I am charged with is ensuring that regional integration is achieved in the best way possible. Now, when I started my journey at university, they had this lovely festival where every island had an opportunity to display their culture. And I'm standing there, I'm walking around, I'm looking, and I realized that every single island had a tent to display their culture, except for the island of Tobago. And when I'm speaking to students who were already at the university campus, they said, listen, look, for years, we have been trying to have an established platform for Tobagonian students, and we just haven't been getting there. We haven't had that person who could really advocate on our behalf. And I said, you know what? Okay, Luke is here. I'm going to handle it. So then now I had to mount an 8-month advocacy campaign to eradicate the inequality, marginalization, the sense of invisibility, and also the adversarial institution that we as Tobagonian students will studying at. And we always longed for that community, because when you think about us as Tobagonian university students, we have to pack up everything and leave home because it's two different islands. So we have to leave home, we have to relocate to an area that's really not what we are accustomed to. And we are feeling homesick. We want our sense of community, because in Tobago, our culture is probably one of our biggest cultural calling cards. We love our culture. And when we don't have a platform where we can celebrate that, and everyone else has that platform, and we just have to stand on the sidelines, we thought that that in itself was extremely inhumane. We think that our rights as Tobagonian students, and by extent citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, our rights were being infringed upon. So we had to do something to establish the Tobago Students Association. So I'm there, I'm doing my advocacy, but in reality, to be truth, I was not getting the traction that I really wanted to get. So I had to turn this conversation from a unique conversation into a more national, regional conversation. How do I do that? So I'm there. I remember I was sitting in one of my law classes and we were talking about constitutional reform. And then the UN would have come up and I was like, oh, the UN. So let me take it up a notch a bit. So I remember when I was doing a TV interview and I'm telling the interviewer, listen, I think that the establishment of the Tobago Students Association aligns perfectly with SDGs 10 and 16, and any objection to the establishment of the Tobago Students Association that we are currently facing here on the university campus, because to be honest, we had a team of people that were hell-bent on ensuring that we did not get that association. I said, I think that if we don't establish this Tobago Students Association, it goes against the effort of the SDGs to bring synergy across the sectors. And when I started quoting the SDGs and bringing the SDGs into my campaign, then I started seeing that the conversation for the Tobago Students Association became a national conversation. We started getting buy-in from the newspaper agencies. I started doing more interviews. People were more interested in what the Tobago Students Association was all about. And more importantly, how we were trying to battle that sense of inequality and marginalization that we are facing. And then we were able not only to establish the Tobago Students Association, but we were able to effect a change in the policy at the university campus. So now, for the first time in years, we now have the student guild. They have implemented a policy where now on the national committee, a Tobagonian student will sit as a representative on the executive, something that has never happened for years. And now we have right in the island of Tobago so many people so appreciative of the Tobago Students Association, because it's a bigger conversation. Right now we have constitutional reform going on to get the island more recognized, that we have more independence over the matters that really matter to the island of Tobago. And it's through these little platforms as the Tobago Students Association where we can eradicate this pervasive sense of marginalization and invisibility faced by university students. Then we are seeing, okay, maybe the UN human rights actually does exist, because we are seeing it here through the association. So now my plea to young people is to never underestimate the backing of the UN, especially where the SDGs are concerned. Because when you think about the SDGs, these SDGs are a universally recognized framework that really aligns local and national initiatives with global priorities. So when you really want to boost your advocacy campaign, all you have to do is look to see what the UN is doing, because you are going to find something that aligns perfectly with what you are advocating for. Because one of the strengths of advocacy is always, ensuring that you have the data, that you have the evidence, that you have the resources, and the UN is an excellent resource in itself. So when you start quoting the UN and you start quoting the SDGs, for example, you are now seeing, for example, in my case, I saw a broader support network. We started getting buy-in from governments. We started getting buy-in from NGO stakeholders, even the banks. I remember when I was sitting with one of the banks and I wanted funding, and they were asking me, so why do you want funding for the Tobago Students Association? And I was able to quote the 2030 agenda. I was like, listen, this is what the agenda is saying, and I'm very confident that the association aligns with this. So if you can support us, I think that we are gonna in turn really achieve what the UN is working towards, because we want to eradicate inequality. We want to build peaceful and strong institutions and really have the justice that people really urge for. So, in reality and in conclusion, bringing in those international frameworks took my advocacy to a next level that I never expected. And I'm somebody that has been advocating for a long while, and this was the first time I actually used the UN, used those international frameworks to build my advocacy campaign. And the exposure that we were able to get, the respect and the legitimacy we were able to get to the Tobago Students Association. Wow, I have not seen that in all my years.
Thanks, Luke, and congratulations. You've brought up an important point, reminding us that states have an obligation to domesticate and implement international standards and frameworks that they have signed up to, and that we can push them to do this and remind them that these are international standards that that need to be implemented. Now, just going back to the international platforms and linking these global spaces to local spaces, local communities. Ishan and Poppy. So the question I have for you both is, how did you work with young people? And Ishan, you mentioned this a little bit earlier. How did you work with young people at local level to ensure that their needs and priorities are amplified and reflected in those debates and in those discussions and policies and the legal frameworks that are being deliberated and developed at international level, including by the UN? So can you explain how you harnessed youth voice? So Ishan, can we maybe start with you?
Yeah, I think this is a major gap in the UN system as well. I think the UN is just so inaccessible for young people, mostly because of this lack of information sharing, but also because a lot of these processes happen behind closed doors. Organizations need special accreditation. Hybrid modalities are not even possible now. The UN is going through a liquidity crisis because member states haven't been paying their dues. But really operating in a shrinking civic space, a shrinking space for civil society. And I think that young people in particular just face the brunt of that the most, because we're just not able to keep up with the pace of the UN. We're not resourced enough. We don't have enough sort of funding. We don't have enough information. There's so many of these barriers that we have. So I think what we, and I'm sure I speak for Poppy and for Luke as well, I think when we have access to these spaces, I think we take it very seriously, and very importantly, that we are opening the space as much as possible, that we're sharing information, and that we're convening spaces in which young people can understand that engaging with the UN, which is a monster of an organization, doesn't necessarily mean traveling to these conferences in person. A lot of the work happens months in advance, when your national government is forming that position for a UN process, for example, or when you're negotiating blocks. So whether it's the African Union or the EU, the group of Latin American states, they all come together well in advance to formulate their priorities. And I think that's the entry point that we as young people need to be hitting on. We need to be reaching out to our national governments. And so when we convene these consultations, these groups, we try and do it well in advance. We try and make it as accessible as possible. So it's not necessarily always just a Zoom call, for example. We have Google Forms. We'll send emails. We've had people handwrite recommendations and scan them into us just because they didn't have internet connectivity to join these online consultations. And I think the important part is just making sure that we're sharing information and sharing contacts as well. Because the diplomats and the UN staff really like to keep their email addresses personal, but they work for the people. The international civil servants, they work for us. We the peoples. And so we really try to open the space. And we also really understand as well that not all young people want to engage with the UN. There's a lot of distrust in the UN system. There's a lot of distrust in multilateralism. But for us UN nerds who really believe that there's something there and that this is the best we've got, we really like to act as that bridge between really getting the energy and the demands, those grassroots raw activist demands of young people, and translating them into the very awkward, jargony UN language that then is negotiated by member states in Geneva and New York. But I think for us, the most important is being as transparent as possible, and also the accountability piece. And that's internal accountability. So for us, holding each other, other youth constituencies, our peers to account, and really acting as a connector and a facilitator of these spaces.
Yeah, thanks, Ishan. And maybe Poppy, can you come in here and explain how you are able to harness youth voice and take those messages to the international spaces?
Yeah, so I think what Ishan said about like using a consultative approach is like a really important and really strong way to do it. And complementary to that is also about so this is kind of the choice approach, is making sure that meaningful and inclusive youth participation, it doesn't just mean that youth issues are debated by the UN, but it means that young people are speaking for themselves there as well. And this can look like being in consultations, but it can also look like knowledge sharing. So, you know, young people, they need the knowledge and the skills and the access on what it means to attend the UN and to conduct UN advocacy. Because, yeah, I think it's been mentioned, the UN is not youth friendly, it's not accessible. And so, you know, we need to, if we're in a position of privilege, then we need to make it our mission to inform and to provide tools for young people to break down these barriers. So Choice, yeah, uses this approach of giving a lot of trainings, holding workshops, not dissimilar to this wonderful webinar today. We also are holding another one for youth activists that we work with next week, specifically ahead of the Human Rights Council session in September, about like how can young people engage. And we also use our, so I don't know if has the term ECOSOC status being mentioned already today? I don't know, but essentially it's it's quite complex, so I'll try and explain it as easily as possible. But essentially, it's a special consultative status that NGOs can apply for. It takes quite some time to get, and there's also quite a lot of politics around it. Choice does have this ECOSOC status. It took us 9 years to get it, and it's quite difficult. But once you have this registration, it's essentially saying to the UN that you are like an accepted NGO. It's a whole thing that I could get into. Also, there's a lot of power dynamics and privileged discussions that come with it. But once you have that ECOSOC status, you can bring youth advocates and youth activists with you underneath. They can register as being like a representative of your NGO. So we always make it our mission to bring young people to any advocacy space, to make sure that young people are there in force, in representation, and can speak directly to diplomats and can speak directly at the UN. And we also encourage like adult organizations to do the same and to use their status to like broker this space. And yeah, otherwise we make sure that we are creating resources. We have a wealth of resources on our website. We're creating even more. We just want to make sure that young people are as informed as possible about what it means to engage in the UN, and also to make sure that they do so in a healthy way. So I think that's something that I don't want to miss out from this discussion, is that like the UN is as Ishan said, it's a monster, right? And the work is really intense. We're pushing our way into these spaces where a lot of people want to keep us out. And so we also need to make sure that, I mean, this is the approach that Choice takes, but also for anyone here who is engaging or wants to engage, make sure you take care of your mental health when engaging with the UN. Like the activism has to be done in a healthy way, because it is exhausting. And especially as young people, I think if we can learn to do healthy activism young, then it sets a really good precedent for us going ahead and for the next generation that comes after us as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Poppy, for that. Yeah, I think you're right. I think accessibility is a challenge, but I think it's really a question of demystifying the processes. You know, the UN is there. Some of the mechanisms are more accessible than others. And it's a question of finding the opportunities, you know, finding those organizations that already have this ECOSOC status, that have the access to the UN spaces, that can attend the UN meetings, and then engaging with them and partnering with them so that your needs and priorities are also reflected in what happens in those spaces. And it's in, you know, there are international NGOs, CHRI is one of them as well. There are international NGOs that use their ECOSOC status very diplomatically, liberally, inclusively, so that they are reflecting the voices of those that may not be able to access those spaces. So that's something to really keep in mind. You mentioned, both of you mentioned a little bit about barriers, and that's my next question for you all. So I know I'm just keeping an eye on the clock as well, though I'd like to get into just a reflection on what some of the challenges are that you've faced when engaging with the international frameworks and the international mechanisms, or you're accessing international spaces. You mentioned a little bit already about access, but what are some of the other challenges that you faced, particularly for youth, for young people? And also, I mean, more importantly, how did you address these challenges? Because some of these challenges have been, there are ways of negotiating them. There are ways of getting around them. So we ensure that processes are inclusive. So share with us some of the challenges and some of the ways you've addressed them. Luke, let's start with you.
Okay, sure. So one of the main challenges that I faced during my advocacy campaign for the Tobago Students Association was the lack of awareness where the SDGs were concerned within the youth space. So currently I have an executive of 15 members, and when we were there caucusing and we were strategizing, how we're going to do the advocacy and so on, I told them I'm going to start using a joint reference to the SDGs, and they were like, what is that? I'm like, the SDGs is like, you don't know what's the SDGs? It's like, no, we don't know what are the SDGs. And I remember when I started, educating them and telling them, okay, this is what the SDGs are about. One of them, who is really big on climate change, she was like, oh, you mean those boxes they have for decorations when we go to forums? I was like, they are much more than decorations. So what I did is that I did a little educational campaign within my executive, because these are young people who have the influence, who have the voice. And I want that when they went back out to the public space, they were able to not only educate people about the SDGs and why the Tobago Students Association align with it, but also let the youth know about the efforts of the UN. Now, owing to the fact that I would have recognized that when you look at our educational curriculum, we don't really learn about the SDGs in school. We don't learn about it in primary school or high school in the Caribbean. I'm not sure how it's set up in other international educational institutions. But one problem that I have identified is that the youth needs to be educated about the SDGs in a way that is conducive to young people. Now, in the Caribbean, one thing that young people always tune into, it doesn't matter if you're involved in youth work, it doesn't matter if you're just a regular youth, one thing that young people always tune into is our youth parliament. And I remember I was speaking to a speaker of this, I was like, listen, I think we need to dedicate 2 of our debates to the efforts of the UN. And she was like, why? I was like, when you think about youth parliament and you look at the influence youth parliament have, every time we have a youth parliament, the entire Caribbean region and even those abroad, they will tune in and they will look to see what we are debating about. So if we start incorporating the efforts of the UN and start speaking about things like the SDGs, we will start educating youth in a way that is actually appealing to young people. Because when you look on TikTok, when you look on Instagram, when you even look on WhatsApp statuses, you will see these little snippets of the youth parliaments. So I think that is an excellent medium to educate young people about the SDGs, because sadly, not every young person, my apologies, is educated when it comes to the SDGs and by extent, the efforts of the UN. So I think we can start there. I think it's an excellent initiative. I think that we need to start, appealing to young people. Sometimes not everyone wants to sit down in a session, not everyone wants to go to a forum. But when you start looking at the things that young people are more receptive to, that is when we start seeing that, young people will start to pay attention. They will start to buy in. They will also start to meaningfully participate in these procedures. So that is one thing that I have identified, and that is one of the strategies that I am currently working towards to address it.
So raising awareness is a big issue that needs to be addressed. Thank you for that, Luke. So let's turn to Ishan. What are some of the challenges that you've seen? You've mentioned them. You've mentioned some of the challenges you faced in terms of accessibility, but what are some of the other challenges that you see to engaging with the international mechanisms, and how can we address some of those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, awareness raising, as Luke mentioned, is one of the big ones as well. I think it's how do you communicate the UN and its processes in a way which young people can actually engage with that. And a lot of us young people are absorbing our content through, TikTok, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, which are 15-second quite type videos. And for many of us who know, it's very hard to explain a UN process in 15 seconds, right? Or to get even our priorities across, because there are so many. So I think it's also a lot of communicating with other youth organizations who are doing similar work. So Luke will be in touch with you as well to see how you're implementing your awareness and educational programs, because not all young people, not all constituencies communicate the same way. The language barrier is a big one too. So, when we develop resources, we try and translate it into as many languages as possible with regards to the information sharing. It's quite hard. We have a WhatsApp group. We are in the process of developing a website that will actually sort of upload all these draft resolutions and sort of explain these processes in a bit more detail. We used to have a blog that sort of, in a very Gen Z, maybe in a too sort of cliche type of way, sort of was explaining these processes. But I mean, there's so much, and I think there's not enough around how we communicate what the UN does, that I think there are endless possibilities. So I encourage everyone on this webinar as well to sort of look at the way in which the UN works, the issues that you're passionate about, and sort of be very creative in the way that you communicate it with your in the spaces you occupy. That could be even within your household, right, within your family, within your school groups, community groups, universities, wherever it may be. So I think those are the main challenges. And then there's challenges around sort of what you actually do when you engage with the decision makers. I'll put the email address for the UN Youth Office in the chat, but we essentially have an office now. So if you care so much about an issue and you find like the UN process that's related to it, the office is there to connect you with those processes. So email that office, introduce yourself, tell them you're a young leader from XYZ country working on XYZ issue. You want to get more involved, and they will connect you. That's exactly what I did back in 2020. I think it was 2021, 2020. I emailed the UN Youth Office. I said, well, I'm interested in combating modern slavery. They connected me to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, their civil society division. And from there, we were able to co-create spaces that really opened up opportunities for young people to engage with the UN and with their mandate on combating human trafficking in particular. So definitely would encourage you to keep reaching out to people, even on LinkedIn as well, and pester these people. The UN is a very slow institution, so keep at it, keep persevering around it. But I think those are the main ones. There are some other barriers around power dynamics and some of the more sort of bigger issues that I think many of us face in terms of, when we reach out to someone, whether it's a diplomat or someone who works at the UN, by virtue of our age alone, we're dismissed quite quickly because we don't have the years of experience, and the expertise, and our experiences sort of don't get recognized as much. And with regards to combating those, we have a Young Feminist Manifesto, which I can also put the link for in the chat. It was a document created by a bunch of us young feminists. I think Choice was involved as well in that back in 2021, to really challenge the way the UN works, to look at the way we look at power dynamics, accountability, decolonial approaches. And that's sort of our Bible for engaging with the UN. And we continue to amplify those messages. And also just continue to convene dialogues with decision makers. So I really encourage you as well to reach out to your local decision makers, and just communicate with them. It's a way of trust building, to show them that you care and to show them that actually having you at the table is a mutual benefit, and can help accelerate progress in that regard too. But yeah, lots of challenges, and we're trying to implement a lot of those solutions. But I think the main point is we also learn from each other as young people. We all share very, very similar challenges. And I think it's great to talk about these in spaces like this and to share the solutions, so we can learn and improve ourselves.
Yeah, thanks, Ishan. And hopefully these conversations can continue. Poppy, what about you? What are some of the challenges you faced, you and your organization, and how did you address them?
It's a great question. I mean, Luke and Ishan already touched on quite a lot a lot of the challenges that we face. But definitely, I want to echo what Luke said about having young people understand how to engage with these mechanisms is something that really it's the challenge and it's the solution, because a lot of people don't understand, they don't know that these spaces are accessible, but then the solution would be to inform. So that's also an approach that Choice, as I mentioned earlier, that Choice tries to take, is to make sure that young people know how to engage, because the more young people we can get in these spaces, the better. Not only does it mean that the outcome documents, the political commitments will reflect the realities of young people, but also it's more fun when there's like a youth movement happening. It's just, it creates solidarity. It makes this advocacy more bearable. And it's, yeah, I think that's something that we really try and push, is to make sure there's enough joy as well for activists when we're doing this work. I think another challenge that we're seeing is, Ishan touched on the liquidity crisis, the budget crisis of the UN. I mean, for example, if you look at how this is affecting the special procedures mechanism, there's fewer measures to include young people, fewer consultations, less capacity because there's fewer people being paid to work on this. But they can be sensitized on youth participation. That is one way that we are circumventing it, is that we're making sure that we're kind of holding them hostage whenever we see them, and making sure they will listen to us. And I think a couple other challenges, like one kind of goes hand in hand. There's shrinking civic space, which is kind of like a buzzword term that we hear quite a lot nowadays. But I think it's also very critical. Like, we're seeing that there's just less space for NGOs, for activism. Like, governments are not liking it. They don't necessarily want, well, I mean, some don't necessarily want to work with us. And because there's less budget, and because of how the geopolitics is working, there's just there is a shrinking civic space. But how can we counter this? So, for example, we can use our ECOSOC status. We can bring as many young people to these advocacy spaces as possible. We can support with visa help, especially for people who like have to, or finances, especially for people who have to dish out a lot of money for visas or flights or something. I think if you come from an organization where you have access to resources and you have privilege, then you should be using that to support others. So that's one way we can counter it. And I think I want to touch on the last challenge that that is by no means the least challenge, is the rising opposition to progressing human rights. The anti-rights movement is getting a lot stronger. They're very well funded and very well organized. And that this is creating more of a problem. So especially with the Human Rights Council, for example, in Geneva, it used to be a space where there wasn't a lot of opposition. And New York, the UN in New York, was where you would see like opposition coming out in force. Now they're recognizing that the Human Rights Council was making too many gains, and that language was getting too strong within these resolutions. So now they're shifting their focus to Geneva. And that is creating a lot of issues for those of us who engage with the Human Rights Council. But what can we do? Don't give up, that's one. But we can monitor the opposition. We map them. We know what they look like. We know where they come from. As much as they know what we look like, we also, we do it right back. We reach out to governments and we sensitize them, and we do evidence-based advocacy. We provide hard data, we provide stories, so that it's really difficult for them to present opinions as facts, because we're presenting facts, we're presenting data as fact. And I think one thing that we are really trying to do is to be more proactive rather than reactive. And it is difficult because often the anti-rights movement is on the attack. I could go into like a whole separate webinar on the anti-rights, but I won't. But we do see them like on the attack a lot. And so often we have to be defending, and that means it's harder to progress because you just have to keep maintaining where you're standing. But what we are doing is trying more to be more proactive and to recognize, okay, where can we go on the attack, and where can we find these spaces where, it's maybe a little more niche, or, work together with different movements, but to make sure that we're gaining ground before they can push us back already. And it's working. There is hope, I would say.
Yeah, thanks, Poppy. I think you've all raised some really interesting issues, and I think it starts with understanding that the UN mechanisms are indeed accessible, and it's linking up. If you're new to all of this, it's raising your own understanding, knowledge, capacity about the UN, so you understand what it is, and then linking with those organizations and individuals like yourselves, and linking up with people who have the experience and the skills to navigate the UN, because it can be complex, but it is accessible. And there are challenges, and these challenges are evolving and they change. But it is possible to navigate that and to do that in solidarity and with others who have that experience and that connection. We will be sharing some of the resources that we've discussed here with the wider group after this webinar. We'll be putting together just an information sheet about links to resources, links to understand the UN mechanisms, like the website I always promote, the ISHR, the International Service for Human Rights Academy. That is a great resource for understanding how human rights defenders and civil society organizations can access the United Nations and the different mechanisms. But also there's others that you all have referenced, that your organizations have produced, that we'll share as well. And these are all supporting. I mean, we need to work together. We need to share and raise our voices collectively. I'm going to now turn to, so I thank you all, and I'm going to now turn to the questions, the Q&A section of this session. And I know that there's a couple of questions in the Q&A. If there are any questions that any of you in the audience have for any of our panelists, please indicate so in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we'll turn to those questions in a moment. Just wanted to say before we start that is that, besides the United Nations, there are other institutions that develop international policies and standards, like, for example, the International Labour Organization, and on labor standards in particular. And I'd like to just take a few minutes now, just a couple minutes, to open the space first to a friend, Owen Tudor, who is the Secretary of the Commonwealth Trade Union Group, who can share with us right now about how young people can engage with the ILO, the International Labour Organization, and those international labor standards. So, Owen, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much indeed, Sneh, and we're particularly pleased to be partnering with you as the Commonwealth Trade Union Group in this work. Just a few words then on the International Labour Organization, which is the United Nations body for the world of work, although it actually predates the United Nations, and it's also the only United Nations body whose governing body has not just governments, but also employers and worker representatives on it. So it is already much more inclusive than most organizations. It covers all workplace rights. Firstly, all member governments, and that's over 160 governments around the world, most UN members, all member governments have to implement the ILO conventions on child labour, forced labour, discrimination at the workplace, as well as freedom of association, meaning the right to join a union, the right to bargain with your employer over wages and other issues, and now most recently added into that core group, safe and healthy working environments. But they also have to implement other conventions that have been signed up to at the ILO if they've ratified them. And recent examples are about gender-based violence at the workplace, about the rights of domestic workers, about training policy, which obviously has implications for young people. And then one of the next ones that's going to come up is about platform worker rights. And obviously a large number of young people are involved in that. Now, in terms of opportunities to intervene in that structure, I mean, everything that the previous speakers have said about the challenges of engaging in UN processes is true of the ILO as well. And because there are also employer bodies and unions involved, it can sometimes be even more complicated. But those unions are, of course, there for young workers as well as for older workers. Firstly, at the ILO itself, which is based in Geneva, there is a judicial process for tackling breaches of the rights set out in conventions. There's a committee on freedom of association, which involves workers and employer representatives, a committee of experts on the rest of the ILO conventions that aren't about freedom of association, which is made up of lawyers, but to which we submit people submit evidence of breaches. And a committee on the application of standards, which again is a tripartite body, unions, employers, and governments, that meets every year in Geneva. And you raise cases with those judicial processes through employer organizations, but in particular through trade union organizations about complaints at the workplace. And probably more importantly, as Luke was outlining, it's more easy to use those conventions and complain about breaches at domestic level, at national level, where you can raise the issue and hold governments to account for failing to do the things that are set out in the core conventions and the ones that they've ratified. So young people who especially if they're members of trade unions, can work with and through those trade unions to raise those issues with governments. Most trade unions, whether they're sort of regional, local, industry based, certainly at national level and so on, will have a youth committee that's made up of young workers. And indeed, at this year's ILO conference in Geneva, the chair of the International Trade Union Confederation Youth Committee, who's a young worker from India, was elected to the governing body. I have to admit, he's probably the only young member of that governing body out of the 56 members of it. But it is at least a start, and there is someone there who does that. The International Trade Union Confederation also has ECOSOC status, so able to engage in the ways that people mentioned there, and to assist in getting young people to these events. And we, generally speaking, want to make sure that the people affected by those conventions and those rights are leading on both the complaints about them and the development of them. So, for instance, it was mostly women who were negotiating the Gender-Based Violence Convention from the trade union side. It was mostly domestic workers who were involved in calling for the Domestic Workers Convention. I hope that's helpful and not too long, Sneh.
Well, perfect, Alan. Thank you. Thanks for enlightening us a little bit about how the International Labour Organization works, as well as how we can use those labor standards to add legitimacy and strength to our advocacy work. So thank you very much for that. So now turning to your questions, I would like to keep a few minutes at the end for final comments from the panelists, so that they can each share one tip for other young people about how one can start, or how can you make your strategic advocacy, your advocacy more strategic at the UN level. So stay tuned for that. But right now I'm going to go to the questions that we have received from you. I'm going to need my glasses for this. So the first question is from Watara Yahaya. So she's from Ghana. I suppose he. This is my quick observation. There's been a lot of progress with adolescents and young people, especially from key population movements in the Europe, Asia, Pacific, as compared to Africa. Is it possible to have a regional link and learn platform for collaborations and experience sharing? I've been pushing this for a long time now. That's an interesting question. So I turn it over to our panelists. Do you know of any support or networks or coalitions of young people that operate at the regional level?
Yes, I am currently a part of a WhatsApp group. We would have created a group when we would have attended the SIDS conference in Antigua, because the makeup of the participants were people from Asia, the Pacific, and the Caribbean region. And we were able to come together to create a WhatsApp group chat where we oftentimes speak about issues that are happening within our respective spheres. And we also send a bunch of opportunities, a bunch of press releases, and we have that opportunity to stick together. So I'm not sure if you would like to be a part of that group chat, seeing that we are now discussing a lot of wider issues and not really just the SIDS. I think that's an excellent group chat for you to be a part of. You can probably reach out to me after, hit me up with your WhatsApp contact, and I'll be able to add you to that group chat so you can see how we are able to stick together. But it's a melting pot of different cultures in that group chat. So I think you will blend in really well.
Thanks, Luke. And does anyone else know of anything that's happening in Africa in particular? I myself am not aware.
I've just shared the link to the Nalatham Collective, which is a feminist collective in Africa who are working on young feminist leadership, but also bringing young people and adolescents in particular into the regional spaces. They focus on gender equality in particular, but also cover other issues. But they're a great sort of regional organization that are doing great work across the continent.
Thanks, Ishan. Okay, I'm going to go on. I'm just looking at the time, and we've just got a whole bunch of questions here in the Q&A box. So I'll try to go through this as best as I can. So this is a question by Patience, and I think Ibrahim's touched on this as well. So their questions focus on specific groups of people. Patients refer to persons with disabilities, including persons with disabilities. The inclusion of persons with disabilities has not been mainstreamed, I suppose. And so the question is, what kind of advocacy and awareness approaches are in use already to ensure that those groups that are marginalized, whether it's persons with disabilities or maybe other vulnerable children and women, this is Ibrahim's question, how can these groups of people be included in the approaches we have to engage with at the international level? Anyone want to take that?
Sure, I'll take it, seeing that most of my work focuses on marginalized individuals. Now, what sets my advocacy aside from other people who are advocating is my ability to strategically use the media, not only to boost my advocacy, but to create that representation for those individuals who are oftentimes marginalized, who are oftentimes sidelined, and who oftentimes feel like, okay, they don't belong or they're not getting that support that they have. Now, one thing I do when I'm advocating through the media is that I always ensure that, especially people with disabilities, that they are able to be a part of these discussions. So when those at home who are looking on, they will look at this interview, they will look at this press release, they will read the newspapers, and they will see someone who is experiencing their reality. And it's through that inclusion and through that representation that we are able to ensure that these vulnerable groups, that they are able to get the spotlight, they are able to get the platform that they need to really advocate for what is really affecting them. I think that the media is an extremely powerful tool because you don't know who is watching, you don't know who is paying attention. And as young people, we are very technical people. We have our social media, we have our own platforms. Sometimes you don't have to really rely on TV, you don't have to rely on newspapers. Sometimes simply picking up your phone and making a snap, posting a snap, it goes a long way. So never be afraid to use your platform to really advocate for what you truly believe in, because that is why we advocate as young people, to really affect change and demand a higher standard of living from governmental organizations and also the stakeholders. So don't underestimate the power of social media. Don't underestimate the power of your platform. I think sometimes as young people, we oftentimes like to wait for other people to advocate for us. Never be afraid to use your platform. That is my advice.
Thank you, Luke. And I think you answered the question of Fathiaya from Ghana as well. Another couple of questions have come up with respect to security, how to keep safe in this very volatile world sometimes. And this is a question raised by a couple of our participants from Pakistan and Zimbabwe. So anyone want to address the issue of security?
Yeah, I can touch on this. I mean, first off, with regards to all activism, whether it's local, national, regional, international, safety and security is paramount. That's the most important thing. I think there are a couple questions on this I was just reading. I find. Oh, there was one about if you're speaking up against the government, right? If you're like what if you get backlash about that? In that regard, I would always create a strategy. So any advocacy that you do, always have a strategy around it anyway, but always make sure that you have some risks and mitigations, and you think ahead about, okay, what is the worst case scenario if we're doing this advocacy and there is the security risk, and then put some measures in place. We always make sure that we have contact people whenever we're traveling or whenever we're doing advocacy in different spaces. We always make sure we have someone, if we're flying to a different place, we have someone on the ground. We have a contact organization on the ground who can look after us if anything goes wrong. It's also really, I think, really important for activists to make sure to think about what information you put about yourself online as well. If you're working in countries where it might be illegal, if you're homosexual, be careful about what information you're putting online, because they can find it. If you make yourself more well known in international advocacy spaces, for example, opposition can look you up. So I would really be strategic about this. And I think it also ties in with mental health as well when you're looking at how you do your activism, because it's very heavy as well. So plan as much as you can and always have mitigation strategies in place. And also if you can have as many contact people as possible, as many people around you to support you as possible, that's a really good move to do as well.
Yeah, thanks, Poppy. And that was the next question from someone, Iman from Malta and Davano from Bermuda, about how do you maintain your mental well-being to enhance your work and have impact while navigating the pressures and responsibilities of engaging with the UN. Does anyone else want to add to that? What Poppy's just said about maintaining your well-being as a youth activist.
I would also just before I touch on the well-being side, just add as well that I think when it comes to your safety, obviously that's paramount. And I think there are other ways that you can engage with, sharing your concerns and priorities without doing it in a way that's going to jeopardize your security. A lot of organizations are already working on connecting with young people in contexts that can't speak out. So I'm sure if you reach out to them, reach out to partners, even if you reach out to us as well, we're happy to connect you directly with, in a very secure way, connect you with people who, and you can raise your concerns, your priorities to them as well. And that's what we really try and do as much as possible, because in so many contexts around the world, people just can't engage for whatever reason, and that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have an opportunity to engage. When it comes to well-being, I find it always great to have a community. I know Poppy very well, and we check on each other on WhatsApp all the time. But we have very close friends and colleagues in the space, and we will call each other, pester each other, we will force each other to take breaks. And I think it also brings the joy of activism as well in it. It's very easy, especially when you're a young person doing advocacy in the international space. A lot of the work happens on Zoom. So you often spend, days at a time sitting at your desk on Zoom calls. And sometimes you just need an escape to rant, to vent, to whatever. And it really helps just to have that community around you, and to also recognize that if you need to take a break, that's all right. There are plenty of youth activists out there who are more than capable of holding the door open for a little bit longer while you take a break and take time to recover and rest so that you can come back and deliver your best.
Yeah, that's very good advice. Thanks, Ishan. I also want to remind everyone that
can I just add on that as well? Because I saw someone say about being deeply involved in social causes, and how that can lead to mental health challenges. As much as we're using social media as a tool for our advocacy, I think it's really important to put a time limit on how much we use it to, like, doom scroll, for example, because you know, how much do you need to see and how much do you need to read to be informed? And then how much extra are you doing, which is just, you know, causing affecting your mental health, basically. And so I would really personally look at that. I have a limit on my phone on all my apps, which I do my advocacy on. I have a limit because otherwise I'm going to keep being on there for hours and keep reading. And some point there's no more information going into my head, but I'm still doing it because it's yeah, it's addictive. So
Very
I would
practical.
definitely a practical tip. I would definitely put some limit.
Yeah, no, good. Thanks, Poppy, for adding that. I think also I just wanted to mention that there are also, if there is a high risk to your security when engaging with the UN mechanisms, there are institutions and people within the UN structures to ensure that human rights defenders, including young people, are kept safe. There is a right of every individual to engage with the UN. So if there is obstructions or obstacles that you face in doing so, you can approach some of these institutions and structures to get some support. And you can often engage with the UN structures confidentially without raising attention to who you are, where you are from, etc. And these can be found, some information can be found on the ISHR Academy that I mentioned earlier. There is a security and keeping safe section that details some of these contacts and situations that that you can negotiate. So we have 5 minutes left to wrap up. So I'm going to now turn it back to the panel, and I hope I've managed to address most of your questions in the Q&A. Thank you all for your very, very insightful questions and thoughtful questions. So now back to the panel, and to round up this dialogue, I ask all of you, what one tip would you share with other young people who are engaging with the UN human rights mechanisms or thinking about engaging in the international space, thinking about getting more actively involved? What is one tip that you would share? And you honestly have, you literally have 1 minute each. So Ishan, please, we'll start with you.
I would say find the area that you're most passionate about and find the corresponding UN process or agency that works on that issue and reach out to them. And if that means reaching out to the UN Youth Office to connect you, I'll re-put the email address in the chat. But just I think that's the most important thing. Don't try and cover everything. From personal experience, it doesn't work, and it burns you out very quickly. So find the area you're most passionate about, and always don't be afraid to ask for help. There are so many of us who have been working in this space for a very long time, and for many of us, we were thrown into the deep end without any support. So I wish I had a session like this many years ago. But I think don't ever hesitate to reach out for help or support. I think I speak on behalf of all of us. We're always here, and I'll share my contacts in the chat.
Thanks, Ishan. Poppy, your 1 minute.
1 minute was hard. I think, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the anti-rights movement is really well funded and well organized, and we need to be the same. So don't compete with each other, complement one another, basically. Delegate your resources or your responsibilities, strategize ahead of time for every advocacy engagement, find out who's going to be there. And also, I think, keep in mind, I saw this analogy, and I'll try and do it within my next 30 seconds. And it's from a Jamaican British activist called Michaela Loach. And she talked about how we have mycelium and mushrooms. And mycelium are the underground network. Sorry if anyone's a biologist and I'm ruining this. But mycelium are underground network of fungi and nature, essentially. And then the mushrooms are what we see on the top. So the mushrooms are, the big wins that we find within advocacy. But it takes so much of the mycelium underneath and so much work and time for those big wins to come about. So also don't be disheartened, because even if you're not seeing like a huge win, even if we don't see something like that in the next 10 years, we are doing the groundwork now for other people to benefit from our work. And everything that we are seeing, any benefit we're seeing now is from, activists 10, 15 years ago. So don't lose hope. It takes time. And to remember that, we're in the mycelium stage now, but we are definitely going to have a mushroom stage at some point.
Thanks, Poppy. It's a great analogy. Luke, your one tip in 1 minute.
Wait, no problem. My advice to all the young people, all the young leaders, all the activists here, you need to first ask yourself, what issue are you willing to die on? Like, what issue are you willing to take and stand in front of government buildings and hold up placards? It all goes into finding your passion. I also want to urge you that the road of advocacy is an extremely lonely road, because remember, you are going up against some big institutions. You are going up against some people who have been so complacent in their lack of work for so long, and then you as a young person coming out of nowhere and trying to shake up that system. It is a lonely road, but don't be afraid to find that support group. Sometimes your support group is people who have no clue what advocacy is, and you will find out when you're able to chat with these people and vent and let them know, hey, this is what's going on. You really have that support group. Advocacy and young people, it's a very powerful combination, because as young people, we are active, we are innovative, we bring those fresh perspectives. But I want you to always remember that when it comes to advocacy, the message is always bigger than you are. That is just one thing I want to leave you with. The message is always bigger than you are. So when you are advocating and you find your issue, you find your passion, don't be afraid to go and check the many resources that the UN has to see how it aligns with what you are currently advocating for. You will find documents, you might even find court cases, you might even find similar advocacy campaigns, and you will try to tie that into what you are currently doing. And that is my advice to those who want to get involved in advocacy on a UN level.
Thanks, Luke. Brilliant advice from all of you. Thank you all. So to conclude, I would like to warmly thank our expert speakers, Poppy Stanbury, Ishan Sean, Luke James Trim, for sharing your insights on youth participation with all of us. And to all of you who are listening in for your thoughtful and inspiring questions. Thanks to also the Commonwealth Secretariat and to the Commonwealth Trade Union Group for their support and partnership in this program, and to Luciana, especially Malvika, and my team at CHRI for putting on a fabulous event.